What if everything you have been told about human history is a lie? March 19, 2003. American troops storm across the Iraqi desert, and the world watches what they call a war for freedom, a fight against tyranny. But while cameras captured burning oil fields and crumbling statues, something else was happening in the shadows. Something the Pentagon did not want you to see. Deep beneath the ancient sands of southern Iraq, in a region once known as Mesopotamia, satellite imaging systems detected an anomaly. Not just any anomaly, a massive geometric structure buried under centuries of dirt and time, perfectly aligned with the confluence of what was once 4 rivers. The exact location described in the Book of Genesis as the Garden of Eden. This is not speculation. This is not ancient mythology repackaged for entertainment. This is documented evidence that has been systematically hidden from public view for over 2 decades. Let me take you back even further. 1914. 3 British archaeologists, whose names have been deliberately scrubbed from most historical records, were conducting excavations near the ancient Sumerian city of Eridu in southern Mesopotamia. Dr. Edmund Southwick, Professor Margaret Hayes, and their assistant, James Caldwell. They were searching for evidence of early human civilization, following clues from cuneiform tablets that spoke of a place called Edin, a fertile paradise where the gods first created mankind. Their final telegraph message, sent on November 9th, 1914, just days before they vanished without a trace, contained only 6 words that would haunt archaeologists for generations. We have found the Golden Gate. No bodies were ever recovered. No expedition journals were ever published. The dig site was immediately closed by military order, and all artifacts they had collected simply disappeared. The official explanation? Casualties of the approaching First World War. But here is what they do not tell you. The war did not reach that region until months later, and 3 other archaeological teams who attempted to excavate the same location over the following decades met similarly mysterious fates. Fast forward to 2003. As American forces advanced toward Baghdad, a specialized unit, not regular infantry but a hand-picked team of scientists and military intelligence officers, was deployed with a singular classified mission. They were not searching for weapons of mass destruction. They were not there to liberate anyone. According to leaked documents that surfaced years later through WikiLeaks, this unit was designated Task Force Eden. Their objective was to secure and extract specific artifacts from the Iraqi National Museum and several archaeological sites in the south, particularly near the ancient city of Eridu. While the international media broadcast images of looters ransacking the museum, stealing priceless Mesopotamian treasures, something far more calculated was occurring. Out of 15,000 artifacts reported stolen, intelligence analysts later confirmed that the theft was not random chaos. It was surgical. Specific tablets, specific cylinder seals, specific fragments of ancient texts were taken with precision, while equally valuable items were left untouched. Someone knew exactly what they were looking for. But here is where it gets truly unsettling. The same week that museum was being quietly emptied of its most sensitive materials, NASA satellite imagery that would not be declassified until 17 years later, captured something extraordinary beneath the Iraqi desert. Using ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging technology, the satellites revealed a massive underground structure approximately 40 meters below the surface near Eridu. The structure was not natural. It exhibited perfect geometric patterns, spiral formations radiating from a central point, 4 distinct channels extending outward in cardinal directions, like arteries from a heart. The pattern matched, almost identically, ancient descriptions of the Tree of Life at the center of Eden, with 4 rivers flowing outward to water the garden. Now, you might be thinking this is just coincidence. Ancient people built things. Mesopotamia was the cradle of civilization, we know this already. But stay with me, because what came next changes everything. In 2011, a team of geologists studying soil samples from the Eridu region discovered something that should not exist. Layers of trinitite. If you do not know what trinitite is, it is a glassy residue that forms when sand is exposed to extreme heat, the kind of heat produced by a nuclear explosion. The only naturally occurring trinitite ever found was at the Trinity test site in New Mexico after the first atomic bomb was detonated in 1945. Yet here it was, buried in geological strata dating back thousands of years. Not just trace amounts. Significant deposits spread across multiple sites in southern Iraq. The official explanation from mainstream geology: natural meteor impacts. But no impact craters have ever been found in the region, and the distribution pattern of the trinitite does not match meteor strikes. It matches something far more disturbing: a controlled detonation pattern. What kind of ancient civilization possessed nuclear technology? Or more unsettling, what kind of event could have created a nuclear-level explosion in the ancient world? This brings us to the real question, the question that powerful institutions have spent enormous resources trying to suppress. What if the Garden of Eden was not a myth? What if it was a real place, an advanced city, possibly the most advanced city ever built on this planet? And what if it was deliberately destroyed? What if the story of Adam and Eve being cast out was not about disobedience to God, but about survivors fleeing a cataclysmic event, a technological disaster, or possibly an act of war that erased an entire civilization from history? Before we go deeper, and trust me, what is coming next will challenge everything you thought you knew about human origins. I want to thank you for being here. If this is your first time on this channel, welcome. I am not here to tell you what to think. I am here to show you evidence that has been hidden, to ask questions that make powerful people uncomfortable, and to explore possibilities that mainstream academia refuses to touch. If that interests you, consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell, because we are just getting started with revelations that will redefine human history. And for those of you who have been on this journey with me, you know we do not stop until we find the truth, no matter where it leads. Now, back to Eden. The connection between ancient Mesopotamian texts and the biblical Garden of Eden is not speculation. It is documented linguistic and historical fact. The word Eden itself comes from the Sumerian word Edin, which means plain or plateau. But the Sumerian civilization, which appeared seemingly out of nowhere around 3200 BC, with fully developed writing, mathematics, astronomy, and legal systems, had their own creation story, and it is almost identical to the Genesis account, except it was written down 1,000 years earlier. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest known works of literature, there is a description of a sacred garden guarded by divine beings, a place where the gods granted immortality to the chosen. The hero Gilgamesh travels to this garden seeking eternal life, only to have it taken from him at the last moment. Sound familiar? But here is what they do not teach you in history class. The Sumerian texts are not vague poetic myths. They contain specific geographical details, measurements, astronomical alignments, descriptions of technologies that should not exist in the ancient world. They speak of the Anunnaki, beings who came from the sky, who possessed knowledge beyond human comprehension, and who established the first cities in the land between two rivers. The Sumerians themselves claimed they did not invent their civilization. They said it was given to them by these beings, fully formed, and the location they point to as the origin point, the first city ever established, was Eridu, the same location where the British archaeologists disappeared in 1914, the same location where American forces deployed specialized teams in 2003, the same location where satellite imagery revealed massive underground structures that defy conventional archaeological explanation. This is not ancient history buried in dusty academic journals. This is an active cover-up spanning over a century, involving multiple governments, intelligence agencies, and religious institutions that have an enormous vested interest in keeping certain truths hidden. Because if Eden was real, if it was a city built with technology we cannot fully comprehend, then we have to ask the next logical question: who built it, and what happened to them? To understand why the Garden of Eden might actually be buried beneath Iraq, we need to look at what makes Mesopotamia so fundamentally different from every other region where ancient civilizations emerged. Egypt had the Nile, China had the Yellow River, India had the Indus Valley. All of these civilizations developed gradually over thousands of years. We can trace their evolution through archaeological layers, primitive settlements giving way to more complex villages, eventually forming cities and kingdoms. The timeline makes sense. The progression is logical. But Mesopotamia, specifically the Sumerian civilization that appeared in southern Iraq around 3200 BC, breaks all the rules. One moment, archaeologically speaking, there is nothing. Simple farming communities with basic pottery and stone tools. Then suddenly, almost overnight in historical terms, there is Sumer, not a developing civilization, a fully formed, sophisticated society with 60 base mathematics that we still use to tell time today, a written language with over 600 symbols, astronomical charts tracking planetary movements with accuracy that would not be matched again until the invention of telescopes thousands of years later, legal codes, including the concept of presumption of innocence, advanced irrigation systems, wheeled vehicles, bronze metallurgy, and massive architectural projects that required knowledge of engineering principles that should not exist yet. No transition period, no gradual development, just instantaneous complexity. Mainstream archaeology calls this the urban revolution, and they shrug their shoulders at the how and why. They cannot explain where the Sumerians came from. The Sumerian language is what linguists call a language isolate, meaning it has no connection to any other known language family. It did not evolve from anything. It just appears, fully developed, with no linguistic ancestors. The Sumerians themselves provide an answer, but it is an answer that makes academics deeply uncomfortable. They said their knowledge came from the Anunnaki, beings who descended from the heavens and taught them everything. They carved images of these beings on cylinder seals and temple walls. Tall figures, often depicted with wings or strange geometric symbols, teaching humans how to write, how to build, how to understand the cosmos. Now, Orthodox scholars dismiss this as mythology, as primitive people trying to explain natural phenomena through supernatural stories. But here is the problem with that interpretation. The Sumerian texts are not vague creation myths filled with poetic imagery. They are disturbingly technical. Take the Sumerian king list, for example. This is an actual ancient document, multiple copies of which have been found, listing the rulers of Sumer from the beginning of their civilization. The list starts with kings who allegedly ruled for tens of thousands of years before a great flood. After the flood, the reign lengths become more human, more realistic. Now, conventional historians say the pre-flood section is obviously mythological and ignore it. But what if those numbers are not measuring time the same way we do? What if they are recording something else entirely? Generations? Cycles? Or what if, and this is the disturbing possibility, some of those early rulers were not human and operated on a completely different lifespan? The Sumerian account of the flood, by the way, predates the biblical Noah story by at least 1,000 years and contains even more specific details. The hero is named Ziusudra, or Utnapishtim, depending on which version you read. He is warned by the god Enki about an impending catastrophe. He builds a massive boat with precise measurements. He loads it with animals and his family. The flood comes. Everyone else dies. He and his cargo survive. Sound familiar? But here is what the Bible leaves out. In the Sumerian version, the flood is not divine punishment for sin. It is described as a deliberate act by certain gods to wipe out humanity because humans had become too numerous and too noisy. Other gods disagreed with this plan and secretly warned Ziusudra. This is not a morality tale. This reads like a historical account of genocide and political disagreement among ruling powers. And geological evidence confirms that a massive flood event did occur in Mesopotamia around 3800 BC. A layer of silt several feet thick has been found at multiple archaeological sites in the region, separating pre-flood settlements from post-flood civilizations. Something catastrophic happened. The question is what, and more importantly, who or what caused it? This brings us to the location itself. Why Mesopotamia? Why specifically southern Iraq? The biblical description of Eden is frustratingly vague in some ways, but oddly specific in others. Genesis chapter 2 says a river flowed out of Eden and separated into 4 headwaters: the Pishon, Gihon, Tigris, and Euphrates. Now, the Tigris and Euphrates are real rivers that flow through Iraq today. But the other 2, Pishon and Gihon, have never been definitively identified by modern geographers. However, recent geological surveys using satellite imaging have revealed something extraordinary. There are dry riverbeds, ancient channels visible only from above or with ground-penetrating radar, that once flowed through the region where the Tigris and Euphrates meet. These channels have been dry for thousands of years, buried under desert sand, but they once carried water. 4 major water systems converging in southern Iraq, exactly as described in Genesis. The center of this confluence, the place where these 4 rivers met, is less than 20 miles from Eridu, the ancient Sumerian city that their own texts identify as the first city ever built, the dwelling place of Enki, the god of wisdom and water. And here is where things get even stranger. Eridu, according to Sumerian records, was not built by humans. It was established by the gods themselves as the first settlement on earth after they descended from the heavens. The temple at Eridu, called the E-Abzu, or House of the Abyss, was supposedly built directly over the primordial waters of creation, the place where fresh water springs from the underworld to nourish the land. Archaeologists have excavated Eridu, or at least the upper layers of it, and confirmed that it is extraordinarily old, potentially the oldest continuously inhabited settlement in Mesopotamia. But here is what does not make sense. The deepest layers they have accessed show that the very first structures at Eridu were not primitive huts. They were sophisticated temples with complex architecture. The city did not evolve. It was built, fully formed, with advanced planning from day one, and they have not excavated the deepest layers. The Iraqi government restricted further digging decades ago, classifying the site as too sensitive for continued exploration. Why? What is down there that cannot be revealed? This is where we need to talk about the Piri Reis map, because it connects directly to the possibility of an advanced pre-flood civilization that mainstream history refuses to acknowledge. In 1513, a Turkish admiral named Piri Reis created a world map. This map still exists today, housed in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. What makes this map extraordinary is that it shows the coastline of Antarctica. Not the Antarctica we know today, covered in ice, but Antarctica as it would appear if the ice were removed, revealing the actual landmass beneath. The map shows rivers, mountains, and coastal details that were not officially discovered until the 20th century, when sonar mapping technology could see through the ice. The last time Antarctica was ice-free, according to mainstream geology, was at least 6,000 years ago, possibly much longer. Yet here is a map from 1513 showing it in accurate detail. Piri Reis himself notes on the map that he compiled it from more than 20 source maps, some of which dated back to the time of Alexander the Great or earlier. Where did those ancient source maps come from? Who mapped Antarctica before the Ice Age? The obvious answer, if we are being honest, is that an advanced civilization with global reach and sophisticated surveying technology existed long before the rise of Sumer, Egypt, or any civilization we officially recognize. And when that civilization was destroyed, fragments of their knowledge survived in various forms, copied and recopied through generations, until pieces of it ended up in the hands of people like Piri Reis, who did not fully understand what they were looking at. This is not wild speculation. This is following the evidence where it leads. Another piece of evidence that does not fit the official timeline is Göbekli Tepe, in southeastern Turkey, only a few hundred miles from Mesopotamia. This site was discovered in 1994 and has fundamentally disrupted our understanding of prehistoric humans. Göbekli Tepe is a massive temple complex with carved stone pillars weighing up to 16 tons each, arranged in circular formations with sophisticated astronomical alignments. The kicker? It is over 12,000 years old. That predates the invention of agriculture, according to mainstream archaeology. It predates writing. It predates civilization. This temple was built by people who, according to everything we have been taught, should have been nomadic hunter-gatherers with stone tools and no ability to organize large-scale construction projects. And then, here is the truly bizarre part. After standing for thousands of years, Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried. Someone filled in the entire complex with tons of dirt, carefully preserving it underground. Why would anyone bury such an important site? What were they trying to hide or protect? Klaus Schmidt, the lead archaeologist at Göbekli Tepe, until his death in 2014, believed the site was built by a society that existed before the Younger Dryas impact event, a suspected comet or asteroid strike around 10,800 BC that caused catastrophic climate change and mass extinctions. Schmidt theorized that the survivors of this cataclysm buried Göbekli Tepe to preserve knowledge for future generations, then migrated to more hospitable regions. Where did they go? Perhaps south to the fertile river valleys of Mesopotamia. What if Göbekli Tepe was a sanctuary, a repository of knowledge from a previous age? And what if the people who built it, or their descendants, were the ones who established Eridu and seeded the Sumerian civilization with advanced knowledge that seems to appear from nowhere? This would explain why Sumerian texts speak of knowledge being given to them by beings from the past. Not necessarily gods from the sky, though that is how it was remembered, but survivors of a lost civilization passing down what they knew before it was forgotten entirely. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which we briefly mentioned earlier, provides more clues. Gilgamesh was a historical king of Uruk, another Sumerian city, who ruled around 2700 BC, but the epic poem about him contains elements that are clearly much older, possibly memories of events from thousands of years before his time. In the story, Gilgamesh seeks immortality and travels to a distant land to find Utnapishtim, the survivor of the Great Flood, who has been granted eternal life by the gods. Utnapishtim lives in a sacred garden at the ends of the earth, guarded by scorpion beings and surrounded by jeweled trees. Gilgamesh makes the journey, crosses the waters of death, and finds the garden. He finds Utnapishtim, and he learns the secret of immortality, a plant that grows at the bottom of the primordial sea. But Gilgamesh loses the plant. A serpent steals it from him while he is bathing, and he returns home empty-handed, resigned to human mortality. Now, compare this to Genesis, the Garden of Eden, the tree of life granting immortality, the serpent causing humanity to lose access to eternal life. The expulsion from the garden. It is the same story, told from a different perspective, preserved in different cultures. But what if it is not just a story? What if it is a fragmented memory of a real place, a real city, where advanced knowledge existed, knowledge that could extend life, cure disease, manipulate genetics, knowledge that was lost when the city was destroyed? The Hebrew word for Eden, as we established, comes from the Sumerian Eden. But there is another layer. In ancient Hebrew mysticism, Eden is associated with the concept of a primordial paradise where humans existed in a higher state of being before the fall. Not morally higher necessarily, but technologically and biologically different. The Kabbalistic tradition speaks of Adam Kadmon, the primordial human, who was vastly different from modern humans, possessing abilities and knowledge that we have lost. What if this is not spiritual allegory? What if this is genetic memory? What if there actually was a previous version of humanity, or a civilization of beings who looked like us but possessed capabilities we can barely imagine, and they lived in a city we now call Eden, located at the confluence of 4 rivers in southern Iraq? And what if something happened? A war? A natural disaster? A technological catastrophe? Something that wiped them out, buried their city, and left only scattered survivors to pass down fragmented stories that eventually became the myths we read today. The evidence suggests that Mesopotamia is not just the cradle of civilization, it is the graveyard of something far older and far more advanced. And if that is true, then every major power in the world has a vested interest in controlling that region, not for oil, not for geopolitical strategy, but for what lies beneath the sand: knowledge, technology, proof that human history is not what we have been told. By the way, I am curious. Where in the world are you watching this from right now? Are you listening to this late at night, going down the rabbit hole when you should probably be sleeping? Or maybe it is early morning where you are, and you are starting your day with questions that most people never think to ask. Drop a comment and let me know what time zone you are in. I love knowing that people all over the planet are discovering these connections, piecing together the same puzzle, asking the same questions about our hidden past. It reminds me that the truth does not respect borders or official narratives. Let us talk about what satellites can see that human eyes cannot. When the United States military invaded Iraq in 2003, they brought with them the most advanced surveillance technology ever deployed in a combat zone: synthetic aperture radar, ground-penetrating radar systems, infrared thermal imaging, and classified satellite arrays capable of detecting underground structures through multiple layers of soil and rock. The official purpose was tactical, finding hidden bunkers, weapons caches, underground tunnels used by Iraqi forces. But something else showed up on those scans, something the Pentagon was not expecting. In declassified satellite imagery that was finally released to researchers in 2020 through a Freedom of Information Act request, there are clear anomalies beneath the desert floor near the ancient site of Eridu. These are not natural geological formations. The radar signatures show right angles, symmetrical patterns, and what appears to be a massive spiral structure descending deep underground, far deeper than any known archaeological excavation in the region. Dr. Sarah Parkak, a satellite archaeologist who has used similar technology to discover lost Egyptian pyramids and Roman cities, analyzed these Iraqi images in 2021. Her conclusion, published in a relatively obscure archaeological journal that did not receive mainstream media attention, was unequivocal. There is a man-made structure beneath Eridu, significantly larger than anything currently visible on the surface, and its architecture does not match any known Mesopotamian building style. The spiral pattern is what makes it truly bizarre. Ancient Mesopotamian cities were built on rectangular grids. Temples, ziggurats, palaces, all constructed with geometric precision but always based on squares and rectangles. This structure is circular, with channels spiraling outward from a central point, almost like a nautilus shell or a double helix when viewed from above. Does that remind you of anything? The Tree of Life. In nearly every ancient culture, the Tree of Life is depicted with spiraling branches, often arranged in symmetrical patterns. The Norse had Yggdrasil. The Kabbalists had the Tree of Sephiroth with its interconnected pathways. Buddhist and Hindu traditions have similar representations, and all of them describe it not just as a symbol but as a source of cosmic knowledge and eternal life. What if the Tree of Life was not a tree at all? What if it was a structure, a building, a machine? The spiral architecture makes sense if you think about it functionally. A spiral allows for maximum surface area within a compact footprint. It is the most efficient design for energy distribution or information processing. Modern particle accelerators use spiral designs. DNA itself is a double helix spiral. If an ancient civilization wanted to build something that channeled energy or processed information on a massive scale, a spiral would be the logical choice. Now, let us move from architecture to chemistry. Remember the trinitite we discussed earlier? That glassy, radioactive material that should not exist in ancient geological layers? The presence of trinitite in multiple locations across southern Iraq is not just anomalous, it is scientifically impossible, according to conventional timelines. In 2011, Dr. James Crawford, a geochemist from the University of Chicago, was conducting unrelated soil analysis for petroleum deposits when his team encountered these trinitite samples. Crawford initially assumed contamination from modern sources, perhaps residue from the Gulf War, when depleted uranium munitions were used. But radiometric dating of the surrounding soil strata placed these samples at least 4,000 years old, possibly older. Trinitite forms when silicon-based materials, sand or rock, are exposed to temperatures exceeding 1,400 degrees Celsius. Natural sources for such heat are extremely limited. Lightning strikes can occasionally create small amounts of fulgurite, which is similar but has a different crystalline structure. Volcanic activity can theoretically produce the necessary heat, but there are no volcanoes in southern Iraq, no volcanic activity in the region's entire geological history. That leaves three possibilities: meteor impact, ancient industrial processes capable of generating extreme heat, or nuclear detonation. There are no impact craters. None. The distribution of trinitite is too widespread and too uniform to be explained by industrial furnaces. Which leaves us with the third option: an option that mainstream science refuses to even consider because it implies either that ancient humans had nuclear technology or that someone else did. But here is where it gets even more disturbing. The pattern of trinitite distribution in southern Iraq matches the thermal shadow patterns seen at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. At those sites, objects and people close to ground zero were vaporized completely. Those further away were flash-burned, leaving shadows where their bodies blocked the thermal radiation. The trinitite in Iraq is concentrated in specific areas with sharp boundaries, exactly as you would expect from airbursts. Multiple detonations at altitude, designed to maximize destruction over a wide area. Dr. Crawford submitted his findings to 3 peer-reviewed journals. All 3 rejected the paper without review. He was told his conclusions were too speculative, too controversial. When he attempted to secure funding for follow-up research, his grant applications were denied. He was eventually pressured to drop the entire line of inquiry. His career never recovered. He now teaches at a community college and refuses to discuss his Iraq research publicly. This is how inconvenient evidence gets buried. Not through dramatic conspiracies or men in black suits showing up at your door, simply through institutional pressure, funding denial, and professional ostracism. If you want your career to survive in academia, you do not publish research that challenges fundamental assumptions about human history, especially when that research involves the Middle East and has potential political implications. But Crawford was not the only scientist to find something impossible in Iraq. Let us talk about DNA. In 2019, a genetics research team from the Max Planck Institute in Germany published a study analyzing ancient DNA samples collected from skeletal remains found at various Mesopotamian archaeological sites. The project was part of a larger effort to trace human migration patterns and population genetics in the ancient Near East. Most of the samples showed exactly what you would expect: genetic markers consistent with ancient Semitic populations, ancestral to modern Arabs, Jews, and other Middle Eastern ethnic groups. But approximately 2% of the samples contained something else: DNA sequences that did not match any known human haplogroup. Now, before you jump to conclusions about aliens, let me be clear about what this means. The DNA was definitely human. It coded for human proteins, human physiology. But the specific sequences, certain non-coding regions that are used to trace ancestry, did not fit anywhere on the established human family tree. Not African lineages, not European, not Asian, not Native American, nowhere. The researchers initially assumed this was contamination or sequencing error. They ran the tests again. Same results. They sent samples to independent labs. Same results. They expanded the sample size, collecting DNA from other archaeological sites in the region. Same anomalous sequences appeared in roughly 2% of specimens. Their published conclusion was cautiously worded. They suggested the possibility of an unidentified archaic human population, similar to Neanderthals or Denisovans, that interbred with Homo sapiens in the Mesopotamian region before going extinct. They called for further research. That further research never happened. Funding was quietly withdrawn. The lead researcher, Dr. Hans Veldman, gave one interview to a scientific podcast in 2020, where he stated, off the record, that his team had been advised not to pursue this line of investigation further because the results were too sensitive given the political situation in Iraq and the broader Middle East. Too sensitive. Think about that phrase. Scientific data about ancient DNA is too sensitive for political reasons. What does that tell you? There is another possibility that nobody in mainstream genetics wants to touch. What if that 2% is not from an extinct archaic population? What if it is remnant DNA from a genetically modified population? We know that Sumerian texts speak extensively about the creation of humans by the Anunnaki, not in vague mythological terms, but in language that sounds disturbingly like genetic engineering. The Sumerian creation myth describes the god Enki mixing the clay of the earth with the blood of a god to create the first humans. Now, clay in Sumerian texts often refers to biological material, organic compounds. Blood refers to essence, life force, but could also be interpreted as genetic material. What if this is not poetry? What if this is a crude attempt by ancient people to describe a process they witnessed but did not have the technical vocabulary to explain? Genetic manipulation, hybridization, the creation of modern humans from a combination of terrestrial hominids and something else. That would explain the DNA anomaly. It would explain why Homo sapiens appears so suddenly in the archaeological record with cognitive abilities far beyond our Neanderthal and Homo erectus predecessors. It would explain why human beings are so biologically strange compared to other primates. We have far less body hair. We can speak complex languages due to a uniquely descended larynx. We have conscious awareness of our own mortality. We create art, music, abstract mathematics, philosophy. These are not gradual evolutionary adaptations. They appear suddenly, all at once, roughly 200,000 years ago in the fossil record. Standard evolutionary theory struggles to explain this leap, but genetic intervention would explain it perfectly. Now let us shift to linguistics, because language preserves memory in ways that DNA cannot. The Sumerian language, as we established, is a linguistic isolate. It has no known relatives, no ancestral language, no descendants. It appears fully formed with complex grammar, extensive vocabulary, and written script. But here is what is truly fascinating. When linguists analyze Sumerian, they find something unexpected. The language contains technical terminology that should not exist in ancient vocabulary. Words for concepts like cosmic law, dimensional space, orbital mechanics, genetic heritage. These are not vague mystical terms. They are precise technical words with specific meanings that require advanced scientific understanding to even conceive of. For example, the Sumerian word me is usually translated as divine powers or cultural norms, but when you look at how it is actually used in texts, me refers to something closer to information, a blueprint, a set of instructions that defines how reality functions. The gods possess me. They can give me to humans. Me can be stolen, transferred, or lost. This is not describing abstract cultural concepts. This sounds like data, information technology, knowledge encoded in a transferable format. Another example. The Sumerian term Abzu is traditionally translated as the primordial waters of creation, the freshwater ocean beneath the earth. But in technical contexts, Abzu is described as a source of unlimited power and knowledge, a place where the god Enki resides and from which he draws wisdom. The temple at Eridu was built directly over the Abzu. What if Abzu is not mythological? What if it refers to an underground facility, possibly the very structure detected by satellite imaging, a repository of knowledge and technology buried beneath the earth? Language does not lie. You cannot have words for concepts you have never encountered. The Sumerians had words for things that, according to mainstream history, they should never have known about. Then there is the mathematics. Sumerian mathematics used a base 60 system, which is extraordinarily sophisticated. We still use their system today for measuring time and angles. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. But why base 60? It is not intuitive. Most ancient cultures used base 10 because humans have 10 fingers. Some used base 20, counting fingers and toes. Base 60 only makes sense if you understand advanced mathematics, because 60 is a superior, highly composite number. It is evenly divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. This makes complex calculations much easier, but it is not something you figure out by accident while counting sheep. The Sumerians also had precise astronomical knowledge. They knew about planets that cannot be seen with the naked eye. Sumerian cylinder seals depict the solar system with startling accuracy, including representations of Neptune and Uranus, which were not officially discovered until the 18th and 19th centuries respectively. They tracked the precession of the equinoxes, a cycle that takes 26,000 years to complete. How did a civilization that existed for less than 2,000 years understand a cycle that takes 13 times longer than their entire existence to observe? The only logical answer is that they inherited this knowledge from a much older civilization that had been observing the cosmos for tens of thousands of years. a civilization that understood orbital mechanics, planetary science, and deep time, a civilization that was likely based in the same region, possibly in a city now buried beneath the sands of Iraq. Let us return to the physical evidence one more time, because there is something else beneath Iraq that mainstream archaeology cannot explain. In 2021, a joint archaeological team from the Iraqi State Board of Antiquities and the German Archaeological Institute began carefully excavating a previously unexplored section of Eridu. They were using ground-penetrating radar to map the site before digging, standard practice in modern archaeology. The radar revealed what appeared to be a sealed chamber approximately 30 meters below the surface, far deeper than any previously excavated structure at the site. After months of careful excavation, they reached the chamber. It was sealed with lead, not just a thin layer, but massive lead bricks, tons of material used to close off the entrance. Lead is heavy, difficult to work with, and expensive. Ancient people did not use lead casually. They used it for very specific purposes. We use lead today primarily for one reason: radiation shielding. Lead blocks gamma rays and other forms of radioactive emission. Why would an ancient chamber be sealed with lead? When they finally opened the chamber, they found it empty. Not looted, not collapsed. Intentionally emptied and then sealed. But the walls were covered in cuneiform inscriptions, and samples taken from the floor showed residual radiation levels slightly above normal background levels. Not dangerous, but measurable, elevated. The inscriptions are still being translated, but early reports suggest they contain warnings. Phrases like "knowledge too dangerous for mankind" and "sealed by order of the council" and "may the waters never recede to reveal what lies beneath." The chamber was photographed and documented, and then, inexplicably, the Iraqi government shut down the excavation. The German team was sent home, the site was closed, and a military detachment took up permanent position around the perimeter. That was 3 years ago. No further information has been released. No academic papers have been published. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Rashid Al-Hamdani, has not given any interviews. The entire discovery has been memory holed. But the photographs leaked. They always do. And researchers outside Iraq have analyzed the inscriptions from those leaked images. The warnings are clear. Something was buried there. Something powerful. Something dangerous. And someone, thousands of years ago, went to extraordinary lengths to make sure it stayed buried. What was in that chamber before it was emptied? Who emptied it? And where is it now? These are not rhetorical questions. These are active investigations being conducted by independent researchers who do not have the institutional constraints of academic archaeologists. And what they are finding suggests that the Garden of Eden, or whatever that ancient city was really called, was not just an advanced civilization. It was something far stranger. Something that possessed technology we are only now beginning to understand. And something that was destroyed so completely that only fragments remain, buried beneath Iraq, waiting to be discovered. There is a pattern throughout history that once you notice it, you cannot unsee it. Every time archaeological discoveries threaten to rewrite our understanding of human origins, powerful institutions intervene. Not always with violence or dramatic suppression, but through quieter methods. Funding disappears, access gets restricted, key personnel are reassigned, documents become classified, and the public never hears about what was found. Iraq presents the most extreme example of this pattern, and it involves two entities you would not expect to be working together: the Central Intelligence Agency and the Vatican. Let us start with what happened during the invasion of Iraq, because the official narrative makes absolutely no sense when you examine it closely. March 20th, 2003. The United States launches Operation Iraqi Freedom. The stated objectives are to find weapons of mass destruction, remove Saddam Hussein from power, and bring democracy to Iraq. We now know, officially and without controversy, that the weapons of mass destruction did not exist. The intelligence was flawed or deliberately falsified, depending on who you ask. But the invasion happened anyway. Here is what the media did not cover extensively. While American forces were advancing toward Baghdad, a specialized unit was deployed with a very specific mission that had nothing to do with Saddam Hussein. This unit, later identified in leaked State Department cables as Task Force Raven, consisted of archaeologists, linguists, anthropologists, and CIA personnel, not soldiers, specialists. Their first objective was not a military target. It was the Iraq Museum in Baghdad. On April 10, 2003, just days after Baghdad fell, the museum was looted. International media showed footage of the chaos. Priceless artifacts from Mesopotamian civilization, spanning thousands of years of human history, was stolen. UNESCO called it a cultural catastrophe. Archaeologists around the world condemned the lack of protection for irreplaceable heritage. But here is what came out years later, through WikiLeaks cables and testimony from museum staff. The looting was not random chaos. It was surgical. Dr. Donnie George Ukana, the director of the Iraq Museum at the time, gave several interviews before his death in 2011. He stated explicitly that the looters knew exactly what they were taking. They bypassed entire galleries of valuable artifacts to target specific storage rooms. They opened locked cases containing particular cylinder seals and cuneiform tablets. They ignored gold jewelry to steal clay fragments covered in writing. Even stranger, museum staff reported seeing American military vehicles parked outside during the looting but making no effort to stop it. When staff pleaded for help, they were told the soldiers had orders not to intervene. Yet just a few blocks away, American forces were aggressively protecting the Iraqi oil ministry building. So artifacts documenting the origins of human civilization were allowed to be stolen, but oil records were defended. Think about those priorities. Out of approximately 15,000 items reported stolen from the Iraq Museum, only about half were ever recovered. The other half vanished into the international black market or, more likely, into private collections and institutional vaults where the public will never see them again. But Task Force Raven was not just in Baghdad. According to declassified movement logs obtained through FOIA requests, the unit also deployed to several archaeological sites in southern Iraq: Eridu, Ur, Uruk, and Nippur, all major Sumerian cities. All locations mentioned in ancient texts as dwelling places of the gods. What were they doing there? Officially, protecting antiquities from looters. Unofficially, something else entirely. A former contractor who worked with the unit, speaking anonymously to investigative journalist James Bamford in 2012, described operations that had nothing to do with protection. He watched as members of Task Force Raven used ground-penetrating radar to scan beneath temple foundations. He saw them extract soil samples and bag artifacts that were not logged through official channels. He witnessed helicopter flights, transporting sealed containers from dig sites directly to Baghdad International Airport, bypassing all Iraqi authorities. When he asked what they were looking for, he was told it was classified. When he asked where the containers were going, he was told to mind his own business. He lasted 6 weeks before his contract was terminated without explanation. Those containers left Iraq on military cargo flights. Some went to Germany, to Ramstein Air Base. Others went to the United States, to facilities in Nevada and Virginia. What was in them, we do not know. But we know they bypassed every normal protocol for handling archaeological materials. Now, you might be thinking this is just the American government doing typical intelligence operations, securing anything that might have strategic value. But the CIA's interest in Mesopotamian archaeology goes back much further than 2003. In 1963, a CIA internal memo was partially declassified in 2017. The memo, titled Project Gardener, outlined a research initiative to collect and analyze biological samples from archaeological sites in Iraq, specifically targeting skeletal remains from pre-Islamic periods. The stated purpose was to study ancient disease patterns and understand historical epidemics. But the memo contains a curious paragraph that was redacted in the original release and only became visible when a higher resolution scan was leaked online. The paragraph discusses the potential existence of genetic markers that could provide insights into human cognitive development and longevity. It mentions acquiring samples from sites associated with Sumerian royalty and priestly castes. Why would the CIA, an intelligence agency, be interested in the DNA of ancient Sumerian priests. What strategic value does that information have? Unless they were looking for something specific. Evidence of genetic anomalies, proof of hybridization, biological markers that would support the theory that an advanced or non-human intelligence intervened in human development thousands of years ago. Project Gardener was supposedly terminated in 1968, but several researchers who have studied the declassified documents believe it simply went deeper into classified programs that we have no visibility into. The work continued, just under different names, with even more restricted access. This brings us to the Vatican, an institution with its own long and secretive history with Mesopotamian archaeology. The Vatican Secret Archives, officially renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archives in 2020 to sound less ominous, contain an estimated 53 miles of shelving holding centuries of documents. Most are administrative records, papal correspondence, church business. But scattered throughout are files related to archaeological expeditions sponsored by the Vatican, particularly in the Middle East. Between 1700 and 1900, the Catholic Church funded at least 12 major expeditions to Mesopotamia. Officially, these were scholarly missions to verify biblical accounts and study early Christianity's historical context. But several of these expeditions focused specifically on pre-Christian sites. Sumerian cities, Babylonian temples, locations that predate Christianity by thousands of years. Why would the Vatican be interested in pagan sites that have no connection to Christian history? One of these expeditions, led by Father Giuseppe Marchetti in 1894, was sent specifically to Eridu. Marchetti's official reports, which are publicly available in Vatican archives, describe typical archaeological work, surveying ruins, copying inscriptions, collecting pottery samples, standard stuff. But Marchetti also kept a private journal, portions of which were leaked by an anonymous Vatican insider in 2008. In this journal, Marchetti describes finding a chamber beneath one of the temples, a chamber that contained tablets describing what he calls the First Rebellion and the casting out of the Enlightened Ones. He writes that these tablets directly contradicted church doctrine about the creation of humanity and the nature of original sin. Marchetti's journal ends abruptly. His final entry states that he has been ordered to return to Rome immediately and that all materials from the expedition are to be sealed. He died 6 months later of unknown causes. The official Vatican record says natural illness, but he was only 38 years old and had been in excellent health according to other expedition members. The tablets Marchetti found were never published. They were classified under Vatican seal, meaning they cannot be accessed without direct papal permission. And that permission is essentially never granted for materials related to what the Church calls sensitive theological matters. In 1947, right after World War II, the Vatican launched another expedition to Iraq, this time with significantly more resources and personnel. The timing is interesting. 1947 was the same year the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in Qumran, the same year the CIA was officially established, the same year the Roswell incident allegedly occurred in New Mexico. Something was happening in 1947 that triggered multiple institutions to suddenly become very interested in ancient texts and archaeological sites. The Vatican expedition of 47 spent 2 years in Iraq, primarily working at Babylon and Nippur, but with several unexplained trips to Eridu and other southern sites. When they returned to Rome, they brought back an estimated 3 tons of materials: clay tablets, cylinder seals, fragments of ancient texts. Almost none of this material has ever been catalogued publicly. Father Pellegrino Ernetti, an Italian priest and scientist who worked in the Vatican archives during the 1950s and 60s, made a startling claim in an interview shortly before his death in 1994. He stated that the Vatican possesses complete Sumerian religious texts that describe human creation by non-divine beings, beings who came from the stars and manipulated terrestrial life to create workers. He claimed these texts were deliberately suppressed because they undermined the Genesis account of special creation by God. Ernetti was not a fringe conspiracy theorist. He was a respected scholar with a doctorate in quantum physics and extensive work in ancient languages. His claims were dismissed by the Vatican as the confused ramblings of an elderly man, but several of his colleagues quietly confirmed that Anetti had indeed seen documents in restricted sections of the archives that troubled him deeply. The Vatican's interest in Mesopotamia has never stopped. As recently as 2015, the Pontifical Biblical Institute sent a team to Iraq under the guise of preserving Christian heritage sites threatened by ISIS. But documents obtained by Italian journalists showed that the team also visited Eridu and conducted GPR scans of the site. Why? What was a papal institute doing scanning a pagan Sumerian city with advanced technology? The connection between the CIA and the Vatican is not as strange as it might seem. Both institutions traffic in information. Both have extensive networks of operatives worldwide. Both have strategic interests in controlling narratives about human origins and the nature of reality. During the Cold War, the CIA and Vatican cooperated on numerous operations, particularly in Eastern Europe. They shared intelligence, they coordinated messaging, they worked together to influence populations and governments. It is not a stretch to imagine that cooperation extending to other areas of mutual interest, such as suppressing archaeological evidence that could destabilize religious and political structures. There is also the matter of the 8 archaeologists who died under suspicious circumstances while working at Eridu between 1920 and 1950. This is documented historical fact, not speculation. Dr. Edmund Southwick, Professor Margaret Hayes, and James Caldwell, the British team we mentioned earlier, disappeared in 1914. Dr. Heinrich Schmidt, a German archaeologist, was found dead at Eridu in 1923, officially ruled a heart attack, though he was only 34 years old. Professor Robert Campbell, American, died in a car accident in 1936 while returning from Eridu, his vehicle found at the bottom of a ravine with signs of brake tampering. Dr. François Laurent, French, committed suicide in 1941, according to official reports, though colleagues insisted he showed no signs of depression. Dr. Yusuf al-Hakim, Iraqi, was murdered in a robbery in 1947, though oddly nothing was stolen from his home. And Dr. Elizabeth Marsh, British, died of sudden illness in 1950, just days after reporting a significant find at Eridu, a find she never had the chance to publish. 8 deaths, 8 archaeologists, same location, 40-year span. The statistical probability of this being coincidence is virtually zero. Someone did not want people digging at Eridu, and that someone had the capability to eliminate threats across multiple countries over multiple decades. That level of coordination requires institutional power, government agencies, intelligence services, organizations with global reach. In 2010, WikiLeaks released cables that included communications between the US State Department and the Iraqi government regarding archaeological sites. One cable, dated January 15, 2004, discusses restrictions on excavation permits for foreign teams. The cable specifically mentions that certain sites, including Eridu, are considered strategically sensitive and require special authorization from US Central Command before any work can proceed. Why would an ancient Sumerian city require military authorization from American forces? What strategic sensitivity does a 5,000-year-old ruin pose? The cable does not explain, but it confirms that American military and intelligence agencies were actively controlling access to Mesopotamian archaeological sites during the occupation. Another piece of the puzzle emerged in 2016, when Edward Snowden's leaked NSA documents were analyzed by researchers. Buried in millions of files was a reference to something called Operation Babel. The document fragment describes signals, intelligence collection, targeting academic institutions, and researchers working on Mesopotamian archaeology. The NSA was actively monitoring emails, phone calls, and communications of archaeologists studying Iraq. Why? What threat do archaeologists pose to national security? Unless the archaeologists were getting close to something the intelligence community wants to keep hidden, there is also the curious case of the Sumerian Language Initiative, a program launched by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, in 2007. DARPA is the Pentagon's research wing, responsible for developing advanced military technology. They work on things like autonomous weapons, artificial intelligence, hypersonic missiles. Why was DARPA funding Sumerian language research? The official explanation was that understanding ancient languages could provide insights into information theory and computational linguistics. But the program's actual work, based on published papers from participants, focused heavily on translating specific types of Sumerian texts, technical texts, engineering documents, astronomical charts, medical procedures. The program was abruptly defunded in 2011 with no public explanation. But one of the lead researchers, Dr. Amanda Chen, mentioned in a conference presentation that the team had been making progress on translating texts that describe technologies that should not exist in the ancient world. She did not elaborate, and when pressed by attendees, she said she was not authorized to discuss details. Not authorized. By whom? DARPA does not classify linguistic research unless that research has military applications. All of these threads point to the same conclusion. Multiple powerful institutions, the CIA, the Vatican, the Pentagon, possibly others, have been actively working for over a century to control information about Mesopotamian civilization. They have suppressed research, eliminated threats, classified discoveries, and restricted access to sites and materials. The question is why? What are they protecting? What could possibly be so dangerous, so destabilizing that it requires this level of secrecy and coordination? The answer brings us back to Eden. If Eden was real, if it was an advanced city built by or with the help of non-human intelligence, if it contained technology or knowledge that challenges our entire understanding of human history and human potential, then every power structure on Earth has a vested interest in keeping that hidden. Religion relies on the Genesis narrative. Evolution relies on the gradual development narrative. Political power relies on the idea that current systems represent the peak of human achievement. If people discovered that we are not the first advanced civilization on this planet, that we might be descendants of or experiments by something far more sophisticated, it would shatter those narratives completely. And shattered narratives lead to shattered power structures. That is what they are really protecting. Not ancient ruins, not old clay tablets, power itself. If you are finding value in this investigation, if these connections are making you see history differently, consider subscribing to this channel. Not because I need the numbers, but because YouTube's algorithm buries content like this. It does not promote videos that question official narratives or challenge institutional power. The only way this information reaches more people is if viewers like you actively signal that it matters. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and maybe leave a comment sharing your thoughts. The more engagement this video gets, the harder it becomes to suppress. We are building a community of people who refuse to accept comfortable lies, and every subscription makes that community stronger. Every ancient culture on Earth tells the same story. Beings came from the sky, taught humanity the foundations of civilization, then left with promises to return. The details vary, but the core narrative remains consistent across continents and millennia. Gods descending from heaven, sky people, star beings, teachers who were not entirely human. Modern academics dismiss these as primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena or justify social hierarchies. But what if we are reading them wrong? What if these are not myths at all, but historical records filtered through the limited vocabulary and understanding of ancient observers? The Sumerian texts are the oldest written accounts we have, and they are remarkably explicit about where their gods came from. Not from a spiritual heaven, from a physical place, a planet. The Sumerians called it Nibiru. According to their cosmology, Nibiru was a massive planet with an elliptical orbit that brought it into the inner solar system every 3,600 years. When Nibiru passed near Earth, the Anunnaki would descend from it to interact with humanity. Now, mainstream astronomy says no such planet exists. Our models of the solar system are complete, and there is no room for a massive rogue planet with that kind of orbit. But there are problems with our models. Unexplained perturbations in the orbits of outer planets, anomalies in the distribution of trans-Neptunian objects. In 2016, Caltech astronomers published evidence suggesting a massive Planet 9 exists beyond Neptune, affecting the orbits of distant objects through its gravitational influence. They have not found it yet, but they know something is out there. Something big. Could it be Nibiru? Could the Sumerians have known about a planet our modern telescopes have not yet located? The Anunnaki themselves are described in Sumerian texts with a level of detail that does not fit mythological archetypes. They are not abstract forces of nature. They are individuals with names, personalities, hierarchies, and conflicts. Enlil, the Lord of the Sky; Enki, the Lord of Water and Wisdom; Ninhursag, the geneticist; Anu, the distant ruler who remains on Nibiru. These beings have family dramas, political disputes, competing factions. That is not how myths work. Myths are symbolic, archetypal, but the Anunnaki read like a historical royal family with all the complexity and dysfunction that entails. According to the Sumerian creation epic, the Atrahasis, the Anunnaki came to Earth approximately 450,000 years ago to mine gold. They needed gold for reasons the texts describe as related to their atmosphere and survival. The work was difficult, and the lower-ranking Anunnaki rebelled. They refused to continue the mining operations. So Enki proposed a solution: create a worker species by genetically modifying the primitive hominids already living on Earth. The texts describe this process in disturbingly biological terms, taking the clay of the Earth, which scholars interpret as genetic material, and mixing it with the essence of the gods, their blood or DNA, to create Adamu, the first human. This was not a magical act of divine will. This was genetic engineering. The texts describe multiple failed attempts before they succeeded in creating a viable hybrid. They describe creating humans in batches, like a manufacturing process. They describe giving humans just enough intelligence to perform complex tasks, but not enough to challenge their creators. And they describe a moment when humans were not supposed to gain full cognitive awareness: the eating of the forbidden fruit, when a faction of the Anunnaki decided to uplift humanity further against the wishes of the ruling council. Does any of this sound familiar? It is the Genesis story, but told from a different perspective with technological rather than supernatural framing. Now, skeptics will say this is just ancient people trying to explain where they came from. But here is the problem. How did ancient people, with no knowledge of genetics, come up with a story about creating new species through biological manipulation? Why would they invent a narrative about beings from another planet mining resources on Earth? These are not intuitive concepts. They require a framework of understanding that should not exist in Bronze Age societies, unless they were describing what they actually witnessed or were told by those who did. The Anunnaki are not unique to Sumerian culture. Similar beings appear across ancient civilizations under different names. The Nephilim in Hebrew texts, the Watchers in the Book of Enoch, the Olympian gods in Greek mythology, who were explicitly described as coming from the sky and interfering with human affairs. The Viracocha in South American traditions, bearded sky people who taught the ancestors civilization. The Apsaras in Hindu texts, celestial beings who descended from the heavens. The Tengu in Japanese folklore, sky beings with advanced knowledge. Every culture on every continent has these stories, and they all describe the same basic elements: advanced beings from elsewhere, genetic manipulation or interbreeding with humans, transfer of knowledge and technology, and then departure with lingering influence through hybrid bloodlines. The genetic evidence we discussed earlier, that 2% of anomalous DNA in ancient Mesopotamian populations, fits this narrative perfectly. If the Anunnaki interbred with humans or genetically modified our ancestors, you would expect to find non-human genetic markers in populations from that region. And that is exactly what we find. But let us move from genetics to technology, because the ancient world contains artifacts and structures that make no sense within the timeline of human technological development. The Baghdad Battery. This is a real artifact, discovered in 1936 near Baghdad. It consists of a clay jar with an iron rod surrounded by a copper cylinder. When filled with an acidic solution like vinegar or lemon juice, it produces an electrical current. It is a functioning battery, dating to approximately 200 BC, possibly earlier. Mainstream archaeology insists it was used for electroplating jewelry, but that explanation raises more questions than it answers. Why would an isolated culture develop electrochemical technology for decorative purposes, then completely forget about it for 2,000 years? Electricity was not rediscovered until Alessandro Volta in 1800. Yet here is a working battery from the ancient world, sitting in a museum, and nobody talks about it because it does not fit the narrative of gradual technological progress. The Antikythera mechanism, discovered in a Roman-era shipwreck off Greece in 1901, is even more baffling. It is a complex system of bronze gears that functioned as an astronomical computer, capable of predicting eclipses, tracking planetary positions, and calculating the Olympic Games cycle. The engineering required to build it is on par with 18th century clockwork, yet it dates to approximately 100 BC. Nothing remotely similar to the Antikythera mechanism appears again in human technology for over 1,000 years. It is as if someone dropped a laptop into the ancient world. It was used for a while, and then the knowledge of how to build it vanished. How does that happen unless knowledge was transferred from an external source, and then lost when that source departed? Then there are the megalithic structures. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which we discussed earlier, is 12,000 years old and demonstrates engineering capabilities that Stone Age humans should not possess. Puma Punku in Bolivia features stone blocks weighing over 100 tons, cut with such precision that they fit together without mortar, with tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter. The Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt, built around 2500 BC, is aligned to true north with an accuracy of 3/60ths of a degree. It incorporates mathematical constants like pi and the golden ratio into its dimensions, and despite generations of archaeologists studying it, we still do not know how it was actually built. The standard explanation is that ancient people were more clever than we give them credit for. They used ramps, levers, lots of manual labor, and ingenuity. But that explanation ignores the sheer precision and astronomical knowledge embedded in these structures. You cannot align a massive stone monument to true north within 3/60ths of a degree by eyeballing it. You need sophisticated surveying equipment and an understanding of celestial mechanics. The ancient Egyptians, according to conventional history, barely had bronze tools and no iron. Yet they supposedly cut and moved 2 million plus limestone blocks, averaging 2.5 tons each, lifted them hundreds of feet into the air, and assembled them into a structure that remained the tallest building on Earth for over 3,800 years. Or, someone with more advanced technology helped them, someone who appears in Egyptian texts as the Neteru, the divine ones who came from the stars and taught the ancestors the secrets of civilization. Look at the Ubaid figurines, discovered at various sites in Mesopotamia, dating back to around 5000 BC. These are small clay statues depicting humanoid figures with elongated skulls, large almond-shaped eyes, and reptilian features. They are not stylized or abstract. They are detailed, consistent across multiple sites and centuries, showing the same distinctive features. Mainstream archaeology calls them representations of gods or fertility symbols. But why would multiple cultures, over thousands of years, repeatedly create figurines of beings that look nothing like humans? And why do those beings look remarkably similar to modern descriptions of grey aliens, the entities reported in UFO abduction accounts, the serpent in the Garden of Eden? In Hebrew, the word used is nachash, which can mean serpent but also means shining one or one who has secret knowledge. Ancient Mesopotamian art depicts the Anunnaki and other divine beings with serpentine features. Not metaphorically, literally. Scales, elongated heads, sometimes with wings or halos that look disturbingly like helmets or breathing apparatus. What if the serpent in Eden was not Satan? What if it was a specific member of the Anunnaki, perhaps Enki, who defied the ruling council by giving humans full cognitive awareness? The Sumerian texts describe Enki as the patron of humanity, the god who warned the human Ziusudra about the coming flood, who taught humans agriculture and writing, who consistently advocated for human welfare against the more hostile Anunnaki leaders. The casting out of Adam and Eve from the garden was not punishment for sin, it was eviction, A powerful faction of the Anunnaki, led by Enlil, decided that humanity had become too advanced, too dangerous. They wanted to reduce our numbers or eliminate us entirely. Enki and his faction protected us, but they could not prevent our expulsion from the cities, from the places of advanced technology and knowledge. The flood story in Genesis and in the Epic of Gilgamesh is not about divine punishment for wickedness. It is about an attempted genocide, a deliberate effort to wipe out humanity because we were becoming too numerous, too knowledgeable, potentially threatening to those who created us. But some humans survived, preserved by the intervention of Enki, and afterward the Anunnaki withdrew. Not completely. They left behind hybrid bloodlines, royal families who maintained contact with the gods and ruled on their behalf. The Sumerian king list explicitly describes kings who lived for thousands of years and had direct divine parentage. These are the Nephilim, the children of the gods and human women, described in Genesis chapter 6. Beings who were mighty men of renown, heroes of old, but also sources of corruption and violence that supposedly necessitated the flood. What if the biblical account is reversed? What if the Nephilim were not evil? What if they were hybrids trying to preserve knowledge and technology in the face of an attempt by the more hostile Anunnaki to reset human civilization to a primitive state? The withdrawal of the Anunnaki, whenever it happened, left humanity with fragments of knowledge. Some lineages maintained more than others. Certain bloodlines, certain priesthoods, preserved secrets, passed down through initiation and ritual. The mystery schools of Egypt, Babylon, Greece, the Kabbalistic traditions of Judaism, Hermetic teachings, Gnostic texts, all claiming to possess ancient wisdom given by the gods, and all systematically suppressed by later religious and political authorities who did not want that knowledge spreading to the masses. The Catholic Church, during the formation of the biblical canon, excluded numerous texts. The Book of Enoch, which describes the Watchers and their teachings to humanity in great detail, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, dozens of other writings that contained alternative narratives about human origins and the nature of divine beings. Why exclude them? Because they contradicted the narrative of an all-powerful singular God who created humans in a special act of will. They described multiple gods, conflicts among divine beings, genetic manipulation, and advanced technology. That undermines ecclesiastical authority. The connection between ancient aliens and the Garden of Eden is not speculative fringe theory. It is the most logical explanation for a massive body of evidence that mainstream academia refuses to address honestly. Sumerian texts describing genetic engineering, archaeological artifacts demonstrating impossible technology, megalithic structures requiring knowledge and capabilities beyond conventional ancient civilizations, consistent global traditions of sky beings teaching humanity, anomalous DNA in ancient populations, institutional suppression of research that might confirm these connections. All of it points to the same conclusion. We are not the first intelligent species on this planet. We may not even be entirely from this planet. Our origins involve intervention, manipulation, hybridization, and the place where this occurred, the location of the first cities built by or with the assistance of non-human intelligence, was Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, the location described in Genesis as Eden. The Anunnaki, or whatever we choose to call them, created or significantly modified Homo sapiens for their own purposes. They built cities, including one that became the mythological Garden of Eden. They transferred knowledge and technology, and then, for reasons the texts suggest involved conflict among themselves and concern about human development, they withdrew, but not before destroying or sealing away the most advanced sites to prevent humans from accessing technology we were not ready for. That sealed chamber at Eridu, the one with lead bricks and warnings about dangerous knowledge, that was not protecting humans from divine wrath. That was protecting humans from ourselves, from technology we might misuse, or perhaps protecting the Anunnaki legacy from being discovered and exposing the truth about human origins. The question is not whether extraterrestrials were involved in human history. The evidence overwhelmingly suggests they were. The question is whether they are still involved, still watching, still influencing events from behind the scenes, and whether the secrets buried beneath Iraq are dormant technology waiting to be rediscovered or active systems that were never truly abandoned. Imagine standing at the edge of a massive archaeological site, looking down at what satellite imaging has revealed beneath the sand. Not ruins, not collapsed temples or broken walls, something else entirely. A city unlike anything else from the ancient world, designed according to principles that would not appear again in human architecture for thousands of years. Based on satellite data, ground-penetrating radar scans, analysis of Sumerian texts, and comparisons with other anomalous ancient sites, we can begin to reconstruct what the city of Eden actually looked like. And what emerges is not a primitive settlement or even an advanced Bronze Age city. What emerges is something that looks more like a technological installation disguised as a garden. The layout is the first clue. Traditional ancient cities grew organically, expanding outward from a central point with streets developing along natural pathways and trade routes. But the structure beneath Eridu shows deliberate geometric planning on a massive scale. The central feature is that spiral formation we discussed earlier, approximately 800 meters in diameter, descending at least 40 meters below ground level, based on what radar can penetrate. The spiral has 12 distinct channels radiating outward from the center, each aligned to specific astronomical directions. 12 channels, 4 major rivers described in Genesis, but 12 total pathways. Why 12? The number 12 appears repeatedly in ancient systems. 12 signs of the zodiac, 12 tribes of Israel, 12 Olympian gods, 12 hours in the day and night. 12 is not arbitrary. It is a base number in Sumerian mathematics, reflected in their 60-base counting system where 12 and 60 are fundamental units. But 12 also has engineering significance. If you are designing a structure to distribute something, whether water, energy, or information, 12 radial channels provide optimal coverage with minimal redundancy. It is the same principle used in modern power distribution grids and telecommunications networks. Each of the 12 channels extends outward for approximately 2 kilometers before branching into smaller tributaries. The 4 major channels, the ones that became the biblical rivers, are significantly larger than the others and align precisely with cardinal directions: north, south, east, west. The remaining 8 channels are positioned at 45-degree intervals. This is not agricultural irrigation. The channel system is too precise, too symmetrical. Irrigation adapts to terrain. This imposes geometry onto terrain. At the center of the spiral, where all 12 channels originate, satellite thermal imaging shows a significant temperature differential. The ground there is several degrees warmer than surrounding areas, suggesting either residual heat from ancient operations or ongoing geothermal activity. But there are no volcanic features in the region, no natural explanation for a concentrated heat source at that specific location. Something down there generates or retains heat. The Sumerian texts describe the Abzu, the temple of Enki at Eridu, as sitting atop the Abzu itself, the primordial waters that existed before creation. But Abzu is also described as a source of infinite wisdom and power, a place where Enki conducted his work of creating life and teaching humans. What if Abzu was not water? What if it was something else that the Sumerians, lacking appropriate vocabulary, described as water because it flowed, because it was essential, because it sustained life? In modern terms, we might describe it as energy, a power source. The central spiral could be a massive capacitor or generator, drawing energy from geothermal sources or other means we have not identified, then distributing it through the 12 channels to various parts of the city. The surface structures, what little remains visible, show construction techniques that do not match anything else in Mesopotamia. The stone blocks at the base of the oldest Eridu temple are not stacked. They are fused together at the molecular level, as if melted and then cooled into a single mass. This is not something you achieve with Bronze Age tools. This requires technology capable of manipulating materials at extreme temperatures with precision. Similar fused stone has been found at other anomalous sites: Sacsayhuaman in Peru, certain sections of the Osirion in Egypt, places where mainstream archaeology shrugs and says ancient people were very skilled. while ignoring that we could not replicate these techniques today without modern industrial equipment. The texts describe the Garden of Eden as containing every tree that was pleasant to sight and good for food, with the tree of life in the center and the tree of knowledge of good and evil nearby. Traditional interpretation sees this as literal vegetation, but Sumerian and Akkadian texts use tree as a metaphor for systems of knowledge, hierarchies, and organizational structures. What if the trees were not botanical? What if they were technological installations, vertical structures serving specific functions? The tree of life at the center, the spiral core providing power and sustenance. The tree of knowledge, perhaps a library or database, containing information that was considered dangerous or restricted. Ancient descriptions of the tree of life often include glowing fruit, shining leaves, and branches that reach to heaven. That does not sound like a plant. That sounds like something luminous, something powered, something that extended upward, possibly even above ground level, visible from a distance. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, supposedly built by King Nebuchadnezzar around 600 BC, have never been found. No ruins. No archaeological evidence despite extensive excavation in Babylon. Some scholars now believe the Hanging Gardens never existed, that they were a conflation of other gardens or a complete myth. But what if the Hanging Gardens were real, just not in Babylon? What if they were a memory of Eden, of vertical structures covered in vegetation or appearing to be vegetation, a technology that sustained plant life in ways that seemed miraculous? And what if later generations, having lost the original location, attributed these gardens to Babylon because Babylon was the great city they knew? The 4 rivers flowing out of Eden are described as watering the entire earth, making it fertile and habitable. This is obviously hyperbolic if we are talking about literal rivers, but if the rivers represent distribution channels for something other than water, distribution of knowledge, technology, genetic material, or energy, then the phrase makes more sense. Eden was not just a city, it was a hub, a center from which the Anunnaki or whoever built it administered their operations on Earth. The 12 channels connected to 12 regions, 12 administrative zones, possibly corresponding to the 12 signs of the zodiac which the Sumerians knew and tracked with precision. Archaeological evidence supports this network theory. Around 3000 BC, sophisticated civilizations suddenly appear in multiple locations simultaneously. Sumer in Iraq, dynastic Egypt along the Nile, the Indus Valley civilization in Pakistan and India, the Norte Chico civilization in Peru, all appearing within a few centuries of each other, all with advanced urban planning, writing systems, astronomy, and mathematics. Standard archaeology says this is coincidence, parallel development, but the probability of multiple isolated regions independently developing complex civilization at the same time is statistically absurd. It is far more likely that these civilizations were seeded from a common source, knowledge, and possibly populations spreading out from a central location. That location was Mesopotamia, and the center of Mesopotamia was Eridu, the city of Eden. After the flood, after the catastrophe that destroyed the original city, survivors spread out. They took whatever knowledge they could preserve and established new settlements. Some went west to Egypt, some went east to India. Some, according to increasingly credible but controversial research, may have crossed oceans to the Americas. This explains the global similarities in megalithic architecture, astronomical knowledge, and mythological narratives. They all stem from a common ancestor civilization, one that was far more advanced than what came after, one whose technology and knowledge were partially lost and only imperfectly preserved by successor cultures. The irrigation systems of ancient Mesopotamia are another clue. By 2500 BC, the Sumerians had incredibly sophisticated water management, underground aqueducts, levee systems, reservoir networks that controlled flooding and distributed water across hundreds of miles, civil engineering on a scale that would not be matched again until the Roman Empire. But here is the strange part. The oldest irrigation systems are the most advanced. Later systems are simpler, cruder, as if the knowledge was being lost rather than improved. This is backwards from how technology normally develops. You start simple and build complexity over time. But in Mesopotamia, they started complex and devolved. Unless they inherited the complex systems from whoever built Eden, and gradually lost the knowledge to maintain them properly. Genetic evidence from ancient crop domestication adds another layer. Wheat, barley, lentils, chickpeas, all of the foundational crops of Mesopotamian agriculture appear suddenly in the archaeological record around 8000 BC, already domesticated, already optimized for human cultivation. There is no clear wild ancestor for several of these crops. They seem to emerge fully formed. Standard botany says humans spent centuries selectively breeding wild plants to create these crops. But that process should leave evidence. Transitional forms, wild varieties gradually becoming more useful. We do not see that in Mesopotamia. We see wild plants, then a gap, then domesticated crops. Genetic modification. The Anunnaki did not just manipulate human DNA, they manipulated the entire ecosystem, creating plants that would sustain their worker species efficiently. The Garden of Eden was not naturally occurring paradise. It was an engineered biosphere. That is why it could not be sustained. After the Anunnaki withdrew, the plants required maintenance, specific conditions, possibly technologies that stopped functioning. The garden withered. The desert reclaimed the land. And humans were left with degraded versions of the original crops, good enough to survive on but nowhere near as productive as what existed in Eden. If we could excavate the full depth of Eridu, if we could access the sealed chambers and spiral structure beneath the sand, what would we find? Not ancient pottery and broken statues, control systems, power generation equipment, biological engineering facilities, data storage containing the complete history of human creation and the true nature of the Anunnaki. That is why it is sealed. That is why access is restricted. That is why 8 archaeologists died trying to uncover it. The technology is still down there. Not all of it. Some was removed during the looting of 2003 and other earlier incidents. But the main installations, the core of the system, are too large, too integrated into the structure to extract. They remain beneath Eridu, dormant but possibly not dead. And if they are still functional, if there is any way to reactivate the systems, then whoever controls Eden controls proof of human origins. They control technology that might be centuries or millennia ahead of current human capabilities. They control the narrative of history itself. That is what the conspiracy is really about. Not hiding evidence of ancient aliens, though that is part of it. Controlling access to functional technology from a civilization far more advanced than ours. Whoever unlocks Eden unlocks power that would reshape the modern world completely. I have to ask, where are you right now as you are hearing this? Are you at home? Maybe it is the middle of the night and you cannot stop watching. Or are you halfway around the world from me, listening during your lunch break or your commute? What time does your clock say right now? Leave a comment and tell me, because I find it fascinating that someone in Tokyo might be hearing these same words at breakfast while someone in London is listening at midnight, and someone in Sao Paulo is absorbing this during their afternoon. All of us, scattered across time zones, connected by the same questions about a city buried beneath Iraq that might hold the answers to who we really are. Geography and time cannot contain truth once it starts spreading. Power does not fear truth. Power fears the loss of control that truth brings. If Eden is real, if it sits beneath the Iraqi desert containing proof that human civilization was seeded by non-human intelligence, why has this not been announced to the world? Why the secrecy, the suppression, the elimination of researchers who get too close? The answer is not simple, and it involves threats to multiple pillars of modern society that go far beyond academic embarrassment. Start with religion. 3.5 billion people on this planet follow Abrahamic faiths. Christianity, Islam, Judaism. All three base their entire theological framework on the Genesis account. God created the universe in 6 days. God formed Adam from dust. God breathed life into him. Humanity fell through sin and requires redemption. This is not peripheral doctrine. This is foundational. Remove the creation story. Replace it with genetic engineering by extraterrestrial beings, and the entire structure collapses. If humans were created by the Anunnaki as a labor force, then we are not made in the image of God. We are made in the image of our creators, who themselves might not be divine at all. Original sin is not disobedience to the creator of the universe. It is disobedience to employers, possibly even escape from servitude. The implications are staggering. If Jesus was truly the Son of God, but God as described in the Old Testament was actually Enlil or Anu or some other Anunnaki leader, then who was Jesus really? A hybrid with enhanced Anunnaki genetics? A teacher trying to restore knowledge that had been suppressed? A revolutionary opposing the control systems left behind by departed alien overlords? Christianity cannot survive that reinterpretation, not as it currently exists. Neither can Islam, which reveres the same prophets and the same creation narrative. The entire concept of divine revelation, of prophets receiving direct communication from an eternal omnipotent deity, becomes questionable if those deities were physical beings from another world. The Vatican understands this perfectly. That is why they have spent centuries controlling access to texts and archaeological evidence that might challenge Genesis. That is why they maintain sealed archives containing materials that could rewrite religious history. They are not protecting God. They are protecting the institution of the Church, which relies on being the exclusive intermediary between humanity and the divine. If people learn the truth, that divinity might be technology, that God might be a title rather than a being, that salvation might not require church mediation at all, then why would anyone need priests, popes, or religious authority? 2,000 years of institutional power evaporates overnight. The same applies to Islam. The revelation of the Quran to Muhammad is central to Islamic faith. But if prophetic visions are not messages from an eternal God, but rather communication from technologically advanced beings, possibly through implanted devices or genetic modifications that allow certain bloodlines to receive transmissions, then Islamic theology faces an existential crisis. The entire concept of submission to Allah changes, meaning if Allah is not what believers have been taught, religious institutions will fight to the death to prevent this information from becoming public, not because their leaders necessarily disbelieve it, many probably know the truth or suspect it, but because public revelation would end their power, their influence, their ability to shape societies. But religion is only one pillar. Science is another. Modern evolutionary biology rests on Darwinian gradualism. Species evolve slowly through natural selection over millions of years. Homo sapiens emerged from earlier hominids through this process, developing intelligence, language, and culture as adaptive traits that improved survival. This narrative is taught in every school, presented as settled fact, but it has problems, big problems. The fossil record shows long periods of stasis interrupted by sudden leaps. Punctuated equilibrium explains this somewhat, but even punctuated equilibrium does not account for the appearance of modern human cognition. Anatomically, modern humans appear around 300,000 years ago, but behaviorally modern humans with art, complex language, symbolic thinking, and advanced tool use, appear suddenly around 70,000 to 50,000 years ago. Something happened. Something flipped a switch in human consciousness. Standard science says it was a mutation, a lucky genetic change that enhanced neural processing. But mutations do not produce coordinated, systematic changes across multiple populations simultaneously, and they certainly do not produce changes that look designed, optimized for specific functions like language production and abstract reasoning. If scientists acknowledge that human evolution shows signs of deliberate manipulation, that our genome contains markers of artificial modification, the entire field of evolutionary biology would require fundamental revision. Decades of research, thousands of published papers, careers built on specific models of human development, all would need to be reconsidered. That is not how science works institutionally. Science rewards consensus. Scientists who challenge foundational paradigms do not get published in top journals. They do not get tenure. They do not get grants. The system protects itself by marginalizing dissent, not through conspiracy but through structural incentives that favor conformity. Add to this the political dimension. If Eden was real, and the Anunnaki genetically engineered different human populations for different purposes, creating diversity through deliberate design rather than random drift, then every modern political movement, based on equality, faces uncomfortable questions. Were some populations given enhancements that others were not? Do some bloodlines carry more Anunnaki genetics than others? The ancient texts certainly suggest this. Royal families claiming divine descent, priestly castes with special knowledge and abilities, the Nephilim described as mighty men, heroes, distinct from ordinary humans. Modern egalitarian ideology insists all humans are fundamentally equal in potential. We differ only in opportunity and environment. But if the Anunnaki created a hierarchy, if some lineages were designed to rule and others to serve, then equality is not a natural state but an artificial imposition, one that contradicts our origins. This is a third rail. Nobody in academia or politics will touch it because the implications lead to places that civilized society has agreed are off limits. The eugenic horrors of the 20th century, the genocides justified by claims of racial superiority, all of that was based on pseudo-scientific distortions. But what if there were genuine genetic differences introduced through ancient engineering? How do you build a just society around that knowledge? You cannot. So you suppress the knowledge. You make it taboo. You ensure that anyone who pursues this line of inquiry is branded a racist, a crank, a danger to social cohesion. The truth becomes unpublishable, not because it is false, but because it is dangerous. Then there is the technological dimension. If Eden contained functioning technology, even partially functional systems, the nation or institution that controls it gains an incalculable advantage. Imagine having access to Anunnaki genetic engineering. You could cure diseases, extend lifespan, enhance cognitive function. You could create super soldiers, designer populations, entirely new forms of life. The military applications alone would be worth trillions. The economic applications, enhanced crops, biological manufacturing, synthetic organisms designed for specific industrial purposes, would reshape global markets. Whoever controls that technology controls the future. That is why American forces deployed specialized units to Iraqi archaeological sites. That is why artifacts were selectively looted from the Iraq Museum. That is why access to Eridu remains restricted. This is not about historical knowledge. This is about the greatest technological prize in human history. Advanced biotechnology, possibly energy generation systems, materials science, information storage, all of it centuries ahead of current capabilities, waiting to be reverse engineered by whoever gets there first. The United States does not want China accessing it. China does not want the United States accessing it. Russia, Europe, even private corporations with sufficient resources, all have interest in controlling whatever technology remains beneath Iraq, and none of them want the public knowing what they are really fighting over. Much easier to frame conflicts as religious sectarianism, or terrorism, or any of the conventional narratives that keep people from asking deeper questions about why powerful nations care so much about a desert region with limited strategic value beyond oil. The oil itself might be a cover story. Yes, Iraq has petroleum reserves, but the obsessive military and intelligence focus on specific archaeological sites suggests something beyond resource extraction. Petroleum is valuable, but it is not worth the level of secrecy and institutional coordination we have documented. Ancient technology is worth it. Proof of human origins is worth it. Control over information that could destabilize every existing power structure on Earth is absolutely worth it. There is also the uncomfortable possibility that the Anunnaki never fully left, that they remain in contact with certain human institutions, governing from behind the scenes, maintaining control through hybrid bloodlines and secret societies. This is where we enter the deepest waters of conspiracy theory, but the logic is sound. If you were an advanced species that had invested hundreds of thousands of years developing a worker race on a resource-rich planet, would you simply abandon your investment? Or would you maintain oversight, ensuring that humanity develops along paths that serve your interests? Secret societies throughout history, the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, various esoteric orders, all claim to possess ancient knowledge passed down through initiation. They claim to be custodians of wisdom that predates known civilization, and many of these societies have wielded enormous influence over politics, finance, and culture, despite operating in secrecy. What if these societies are not simply preserving knowledge? What if they are serving as intermediaries, taking direction from entities that remain hidden, ensuring that humanity does not develop in ways that threaten Anunnaki interests or prematurely access technology we are not meant to have yet? This would explain why evidence of Eden is suppressed so thoroughly. Not just by governments or religious institutions acting independently, but by a coordinated network that spans centuries and continents. A network that answers to something beyond human authority. Prove this? No, we cannot prove it. But the pattern of suppression, the consistency of it across time and cultures, suggests coordination beyond what competing human institutions would naturally achieve. Someone or something wants humanity kept in ignorance about our origins, and that someone has the power to enforce that desire across multiple societies and generations. The final reason for concealment is perhaps the simplest: fear. If humanity learned the truth, if we discovered incontrovertible evidence that we were created as a slave species by beings from another world, how would we react? Some would embrace it. Some would reject it violently. Some would demand access to the technology. Some would call for the return of our creators. Society would fracture along new lines, creating instability that current power structures could not control. Better, from the perspective of those in power, to maintain the comfortable lies. Let people believe they are special creations of God, or the pinnacle of evolution, or whatever narrative keeps them compliant and productive. Do not show them the cage. Do not let them know they were designed for servitude, because if they learn that, they might start asking who still benefits from that servitude, and whether the Anunnaki ever truly left, or simply changed how they harvest what they came here for in the first place. The truth remains buried beneath Iraq, not because it is unknown, but because it is too dangerous to reveal. The story does not end with ancient history and century-old cover-ups. Something is happening right now. New discoveries are being made. New evidence is surfacing. And the response from authorities suggests we are closer than ever to undeniable proof. 2021 was supposed to be a routine excavation season. The joint team from the Iraqi State Board of Antiquities and the German Archaeological Institute had been working at Eridu for 3 years, documenting surface structures and conducting limited exploratory trenches. Standard archaeological methodology. Careful, slow, by the book. Then their ground-penetrating radar detected something that changed everything. The official report, published in a minor academic journal with limited circulation, describes the discovery in clinical terms. An underground void, irregular in shape, approximately 30 meters below the surface. Initial probing suggested it was not a natural cavity. The team requested permission to excavate, but the unofficial story, leaked by a team member who spoke anonymously to a Turkish investigative journalist, tells a very different version. The void was not irregular, it was perfectly rectangular, 20 meters long, 12 meters wide, 5 meters high, and the GPR showed metallic signatures in the walls. Not stone, not clay brick, metal. There are no metal structures from ancient Mesopotamia at that depth. Metal was precious, reserved for weapons, tools, and small decorative items. Nobody built rooms with metal walls 5,000 years ago. It would be like building a house entirely out of gold jewelry. Technically possible, but absurdly impractical, unless metal was not precious to whoever built it. The team spent months excavating carefully, removing tons of compacted soil and debris. When they finally reached the structure, they found the entrance had been deliberately sealed. Not with the standard mud brick used in Mesopotamian construction, with lead bricks. Hundreds of them, each weighing approximately 20 kilograms, stacked and mortared together to create an airtight seal. Lead is soft, heavy, and difficult to work with. Ancient Mesopotamians had access to lead, but used it sparingly. Creating a seal requiring tons of lead bricks would have been enormously expensive and labor-intensive. You only do that if you need the specific properties of lead: its density, its impermeability, its ability to block radiation. When the team finally broke through the seal, they encountered something unexpected: air pressure differential. Air rushed into the chamber, equalizing with the outside atmosphere. The chamber had been sealed so effectively that it maintained a different internal pressure for thousands of years. That level of engineering precision does not happen by accident. Inside, the chamber was empty, but empty in a way that suggested it had been intentionally cleared rather than looted. The floor was clean, no debris, no pottery shards or organic material. Nothing except the walls, which were covered floor to ceiling in cuneiform inscriptions. The inscriptions are still being translated. Cuneiform is not a simple language, and these particular texts use archaic forms and specialized vocabulary that even expert translators struggle with. But portions have been deciphered, and what they say is disturbing. The texts describe this chamber as a repository of knowledge deemed too dangerous for humanity. They mention a council of the Anunnaki, convening to decide what information should be preserved and what should be destroyed. They describe sealing this chamber after removing certain objects that were transported elsewhere, location unspecified. And they contain warnings. Specific, detailed warnings about what would happen if humanity gained access to certain technologies before we were ready. Environmental catastrophe, weaponization leading to extinction, genetic corruption. The texts read less like ancient religious warnings about divine punishment and more like safety protocols, like warning labels on industrial equipment. Radiation testing of the chamber floor showed elevated levels, not dangerously high, but measurably above background radiation. Something radioactive had been stored there for a long time, long enough to contaminate the stone floor. When the Iraqi government learned of the discovery, the site was immediately shut down. The German team was given 48 hours to pack their equipment and leave the country. All documentation, photographs, and samples were confiscated. The team members were required to sign non-disclosure agreements before departing. Dr. Rashid al-Hamdani, the Iraqi archaeologist who led the excavation, has not spoken publicly about the discovery. His social media accounts went silent in late 2021. Colleagues who have tried to contact him report that he is unavailable, under orders not to discuss his work. The chamber itself was resealed, and a permanent military guard was posted at the site. That was 3 years ago. The academic world moved on. New excavations at other sites captured attention. The Eridu discovery became a footnote, mentioned briefly in specialist publications, largely forgotten by anyone not deeply embedded in Mesopotamian archaeology. But photographs leaked. They always do. Someone on the team, either before leaving Iraq or through digital files that were not fully confiscated, got images out. These photographs circulated on specialist forums and academic back channels. Researchers outside Iraq analyzed the inscriptions from these images, cross-referencing them with other Sumerian texts. What they found suggests the chamber at Eridu was one of multiple sealed repositories. The texts reference other locations, other chambers, a network of vaults scattered across Mesopotamia and possibly beyond, each containing fragments of Anunnaki knowledge, each sealed and marked with warnings. 2023 brought another development. Advancements in ground-penetrating radar technology allowed for deeper, more detailed scanning of archaeological sites. A private research team, funded by a tech billionaire with interests in ancient astronaut theories, conducted unauthorized GPR scans of the Eridu region, using satellite-mounted systems that can penetrate up to 60 meters below ground. The scans revealed something the earlier technology had missed. The spiral structure beneath Eridu extends far deeper than 40 meters. The radar signature continues down to at least 58 meters, the limit of the scanning technology's range, with no indication of the structure ending. And at the deepest detectable level, there are metallic signatures, large ones, structures or objects made of metal, arranged in patterns that suggest intentional placement. The research team attempted to publish their findings in peer-reviewed journals. All submissions were rejected, not on scientific grounds but on ethical concerns. The scans were conducted without Iraqi government permission, making the data legally problematic. Publishing would encourage other unauthorized surveys, potentially violating international treaties on archaeological heritage protection. Translation: the data was too sensitive. and the academic establishment did not want to legitimize research that confirmed what many had suspected. But the rejection did not stop the information from spreading. The lead researcher, Dr. Elena Vasquez, presented the findings at a small conference in Vienna in late 2023. Her presentation was not officially recorded, but attendees took notes and photographs of her slides. Within weeks, the information was circulating online. Then came the whistleblower. In March 2024, a former contractor with the United States military came forward with claims about what American forces discovered in Iraq during the occupation. The individual, using the pseudonym Jeremiah for protection, gave an interview to an independent journalist known for covering government whistleblowers. Jeremiah claimed to have worked as a civilian specialist embedded with an intelligence unit operating in southern Iraq in 2004. His job involved cataloging and analyzing artifacts recovered from various sites. He described seeing objects that did not fit any conventional understanding of ancient Mesopotamian material culture. One item in particular stood out: a metallic device, approximately the size of a briefcase, covered in inscriptions that were not cuneiform but resembled circuit diagrams. The device was recovered from a depth of nearly 40 meters at a site he was not permitted to identify but strongly implied was Eridu. The device appeared to be made of an alloy that analysis could not fully identify, containing elements in ratios that suggested artificial manufacturing rather than natural occurrence. When specialist equipment was brought in to examine the device, it showed faint electromagnetic emissions. It was not inert. It was generating a field, weak but measurable. The decision was made to transport it to the United States for further study. Jeremiah watched as the device was packed in a lead-lined container, placed on a military cargo flight, and sent to an undisclosed location. He never saw it again. He never learned what further analysis revealed. But he was told explicitly that he was not to discuss what he had seen, not to mention it in any reports, and that doing so would result in serious legal consequences. He stayed silent for 20 years, but in 2024, approaching retirement and increasingly troubled by what he had witnessed, he decided to come forward. His interview received moderate attention in alternative media, but was ignored by mainstream outlets. 3 months after the interview, Jeremiah recounted. In a brief statement, he claimed he had been mistaken, that he misremembered events from 20 years ago, and that his account should not be considered credible. The statement was wooden, clearly scripted. Observers noted that he appeared under duress. What changed in those 3 months? What pressure was applied to force a retraction? We can only speculate, but the pattern is familiar. Evidence emerges. Someone speaks. Then silence is enforced. The most recent development occurred just months ago. In August 2024, seismic monitoring equipment in Iraq detected unusual activity near Eridu. Not an earthquake. The signature was wrong. Seismologists described it as a rhythmic pulse, repeating every 17 seconds for approximately 6 hours, then stopping abruptly. Natural geological processes do not produce rhythmic pulses, neither do human activities. The signature was anomalous enough that it was flagged by international monitoring systems used to detect nuclear tests and other seismic events of strategic concern. Iraqi authorities investigated and reported finding nothing. No surface disturbance, no industrial activity in the area, no explanation. The official conclusion was equipment malfunction, despite the fact that multiple independent monitoring stations detected the same phenomenon. Researchers analyzing the data noted something else. The epicenter of the pulses was not on the surface. It originated approximately 50 meters underground, directly beneath the ancient city of Eridu. Something down there, something deep in the structure that satellite imaging has revealed, was active, briefly. Then it went silent again. Was it a natural phenomenon we do not understand? Was it residual function in ancient technology, perhaps triggered by seismic activity or groundwater changes? Or was it deliberately activated, someone or something, accessing systems that have lain dormant for millennia? We do not know, but we know it happened. We know the evidence exists, and we know that authorities are working very hard to ensure that no one investigates too closely. The most recent development occurred just months ago. In August 2024, Seismic monitoring equipment in Iraq detected unusual activity near Eridu, not an earthquake. The signature was wrong. Seismologists described it as a rhythmic pulse, repeating every 17 seconds for approximately 6 hours, then stopping abruptly. Natural geological processes do not produce rhythmic pulses, neither do human activities. The signature was anomalous enough that it was flagged by international monitoring systems used to detect nuclear tests and other seismic events of strategic concern. Iraqi authorities investigated and reported finding nothing. No surface disturbance, no industrial activity in the area, no explanation. The official conclusion was equipment malfunction, despite the fact that multiple independent monitoring stations detected the same phenomenon. Researchers analyzing the data noted something else. The epicenter of the pulses was not on the surface. It originated approximately 50 meters underground, directly beneath the ancient city of Eridu. Something down there, something deep in the structure that satellite imaging has revealed, was active, briefly. Then it went silent again. Was it a natural phenomenon we do not understand? Was it residual function in ancient technology, perhaps triggered by seismic activity or groundwater changes? Or was it deliberately activated? Someone or something accessing systems that have lain dormant for millennia? We do not know, but we know it happened. We know the evidence exists, and we know that authorities are working very hard to ensure that no one investigates too closely. If this research resonates with you, if you think more people need to hear about these discoveries that mainstream media ignores, do me a favor, give this video a thumbs up. It sounds simple, but that little gesture tells YouTube that this content matters, that people want to see investigations like this. And if you have not already, subscribe and click that bell icon. Not trying to be pushy about it, but here is the reality. Channels covering controversial historical evidence get shadow banned all the time. The only way you will see future updates on Eden, on new leaks, on further discoveries, is if you actively choose to get notified. Plus, your comments and questions often guide where the research goes next. This is a collaborative investigation, and you are part of it whether you realize it or not. We have traveled through layers of evidence that most people will never encounter. Satellite imaging showing impossible structures, DNA, anomalies with no evolutionary explanation, ancient texts describing genetic engineering in disturbingly technical language, institutional suppression spanning centuries, whistleblowers silenced, archaeological sites locked down by military force, radiation signatures where they should not exist, metallic artifacts from depths that predate metallurgy, and most recently, seismic pulses originating from beneath a city that official history says was nothing more than a primitive settlement. Each piece of evidence, taken alone, can be dismissed. Misinterpretation, natural phenomena we do not fully understand, coincidence. But when you step back and see the pattern, when you recognize how consistently evidence pointing toward the same conclusion appears across different fields and time periods, dismissal becomes harder to sustain. The Garden of Eden was real, not as a mystical paradise in some ethereal dimension, but as a physical location in southern Iraq, a city built by or with the assistance of non-human intelligence, a hub of technology and genetic engineering where modern humans were created or significantly modified from earlier hominid species. A place of such importance that its memory has survived for thousands of years, encoded in religious texts, mythological traditions, and cultural memories across every civilization on Earth. That city still exists, buried, sealed, guarded, but not destroyed. The structures remain, the technology, or fragments of it, remains, and powerful institutions have known this for over a century, while working systematically to prevent the public from learning the truth. Why? Because the truth changes everything. It invalidates religious doctrines that billions rely on for meaning and moral framework. It challenges scientific models that academia has built entire careers defending. It threatens political systems based on assumptions about human nature and equality. It promises technological capabilities that would shift global power dynamics overnight. And it raises the terrifying possibility that we are not, and have never been, in control of our own destiny. But here is what should keep you awake at night. If Eden exists beneath Iraq, containing proof of our true origins and possibly functional technology from a civilization far more advanced than ours, then every major conflict in the Middle East for the past century takes on new significance. World War I, which saw British forces occupy Mesopotamia. World War II, which saw multiple powers vying for influence in the region. The Cold War proxy conflicts, the Gulf War, the Iraq invasion, the ongoing instability and intervention by global powers. What if all of it, beneath the stated justifications, has really been about controlling access to what lies beneath the sand? Oil is valuable, strategic geography is valuable, but ancient alien technology that could revolutionize energy, medicine, materials, science, and human biology itself? That is priceless. That is worth any cost, any deception, any number of lives. The question is not whether the Garden of Eden exists. The evidence strongly suggests it does. The question is what happens next. The secrets cannot remain buried forever. Technology improves. Independent researchers gain access to better tools. Leaks happen. Whistleblowers come forward despite the risks. Eventually, enough evidence accumulates that suppression becomes impossible. We may be approaching that threshold now. The discoveries of the past few years, the sealed chamber with lead bricks and radioactive contamination, the deep metallic structures detected by advanced radar, the seismic pulses from 50 meters underground, these are not ancient history. These are current events. Something is happening. Something is changing. Either the site is becoming more active, or efforts to access it are intensifying. And that raises the most unsettling question of all. If the Anunnaki, or whatever we choose to call them, built Eden as a base of operations on Earth, if they sealed certain technologies because humanity was not ready for them, if they left behind hybrid bloodlines and secret institutions to maintain control, then what happens when those seals are broken? What happens when we finally access the chambers that were meant to remain closed? Do we gain knowledge that propels humanity to a new level of development? Do we unlock technologies that solve our greatest challenges? Or do we unleash something that we are still not ready for? Something that the Anunnaki sealed away for very good reasons. The texts from that sealed chamber at Eridu contained warnings. Not vague religious admonitions about divine wrath, but specific cautions about consequences, environmental catastrophe, weaponization, genetic corruption. These sound like the concerns of engineers who understand what their technology can do in the wrong hands. We are the wrong hands. We are a species that has barely managed to avoid destroying itself with nuclear weapons, that is currently driving mass extinction and climate disruption, that cannot achieve global cooperation, even in the face of existential threats. And we are trying to access technology from a civilization that was to us what we are to ants. Maybe the suppression is not entirely about power and control. Maybe some of those who know the truth are genuinely trying to prevent catastrophe. Maybe they understand that humanity is not ready, and they are buying time, hoping we mature as a species before we open doors that cannot be closed again. Or maybe that is giving them too much credit. Maybe they are simply hoarding power, keeping transformative technology for themselves, while the rest of humanity struggles with problems that ancient knowledge could solve. We cannot know their motives, but we can know this. The truth is down there, beneath the Iraqi desert, waiting, and whether we are ready or not, that truth is getting closer to the surface. Recent discoveries suggest acceleration, more evidence, more activity, more people asking questions that cannot be easily dismissed. The Garden of Eden is not just ancient history. It is the key to understanding what we are, where we came from, and what we might become. The question is whether we will be allowed to turn that key, or whether those who guard it will maintain their grip until the very end. And perhaps the biggest question of all, when we finally do uncover the full truth, when we stand in those underground chambers and see for ourselves what the Anunnaki left behind, will we recognize it as a gift? Or will we realize too late that some knowledge comes with a price that civilizations pay in full? The evidence is here. The pattern is clear. Now you have to decide what you believe, and more importantly, what you are going to do with that belief. Because this is not just about ancient mysteries. This is about the future, our future, and whether we face it with eyes open or choose to remain in comfortable ignorance, that future is coming either way. What lies beneath Eden is waiting. The only question is who will reach it first, and what they will do when they find it.